The National Institute of Health is the largest public funder of biomedical and behavioral research in the world. Last year, the NIH received a $289 million increase in funding from the federal government for Alzheimer's and dementia research. With this boost, total spending per year to cure these diseases is estimated to be as much as $3.5 billion. A large portion of this money has gone towards one main theory: the amyloid hypothesis. It's based on the finding that tiny proteins form clusters of plaque in the brain.
The amyloid hypothesis says those plaques are the cardinal mover, the thing that's causing the disease. And most of the other features that we're seeing under the microscope are downstream effects are caused by the plaques.
That's Dr. Matthew Schrag, assistant professor of neurology at Vanderbilt University. All of his views are his own and completely independent of his work with Vanderbilt University Medical Center. He says this main hypothesis inspired many researchers to try and remove the plaques from people's brains in the early 2000s.
One of the most robust efforts at removing those plaques was undertaken in a clinical trial where patients were vaccinated against beta amyloid. It was a very clever trial, and it worked very well in mice. But when the vaccines were used in patients, they didn't improve at all to the degree we saw in mice. And a certain percentage of them developed encephalitis and inflammation of the brain.
As a result, that method was quickly abandoned. In fact, the whole theory of the amyloid hypothesis was beginning to be questioned because none of the research was showing any benefits of plaque removal in humans. But then a cluster of papers, including results from a 2006 study published in Nature, restarted the idea by making a few tweaks to the original hypothesis.
So it came at this interesting moment where the amyloid hypothesis, which had been so dominant, had a bit of a stumble. And this study was part of a suite of studies that was raising a slightly different version of the hypothesis that said, well, maybe instead of it being these very large clumps of this little protein, maybe it's somewhere along that spectrum. Maybe it's a smaller clump. And they termed this small clump of beta amyloid oligomer.
The paper revealed that a subtype of the amyloid protein called amyloid beta star 56 was causing dementia in rats. All of a sudden, the field of Alzheimer's research became completely focused on this new idea, called the oligomer hypothesis. In fact, this 2006 study has been cited in thousands of papers. However, when Schrag took a deeper look at the research last year, he noticed that some of the graphics showing the results seemed to have been digitally altered.
So in the same way you might look at a picture in a magazine and wonder if it had been photoshopped, we were seeing those sorts of things in the scientific results, where they were just things about the images that didn't seem to add up, and that set off the red flags. And then with deeper analysis, what we were able to, I think, pretty convincingly establish is that there were some areas where areas of a Western blot had been cloned, where that same image turned up in more than one place and were supposedly representing different things, but it looked like that they were sourced from a single source image. And that sort of thing raises concerns about whether the underlying data is right, whether the integrity of that data is intact.
Schrag reported his concerns to the NIH last year, which led to an ongoing investigation into the validity of this landmark paper. Hundreds of images are being called into question, disrupting what was once thought to be true. But why is it only now being caught?
And the technology for looking at images has evolved pretty dramatically in a fairly short period of time. So I think part of it is we're probably a little more skeptical now about the potential for manipulating and changing images, data of different forms. And so I think that there was likely a naivety in the earlier time point. And I think the other thing is that sometimes we as scientists expect a high degree of ethical behavior from each other, and we really don't expect that kind of behavior. We like to believe that data manipulation and research integrity problems are very, very rare in science. I'd like to continue to believe that they're rare, but they're probably not as rare as we think they are.
The U.S. government issued the Federal Research Misconduct Policy in 2000, which applies to all federally funded research. Any allegations are handled by the Office of Research Integrity. If its investigation finds any occurrence of misconduct with NIH-funded research, the person may be ineligible to receive future grants and unable to serve on public health service advisory or peer review committees, among other consequences. The NIH currently does not have criminal liability listed as a possible course of action. If anything, Schrag believes this scandal should be a wake-up call for researchers.
This is a paper that was cited in thousands of subsequent papers. So I think that if you read some of the coverage around this and the responses of other scientists, there's been some effort to downplay the importance of this paper, but it's very hard to say that it wasn't a consequential paper when it was cited so many times and in so many different contexts.
But how can we keep this from happening again and derailing decades of research and funding? Schrag notes that one sticking point is that there's little third party oversight because the experts are often the scientists doing the research.
Almost any form of science, ultimately, you have to trust the scientists at some point. It's very hard to verify every aspect of a scientific study, nor is it practical to do that. There are certainly regulatory bodies that are responsible for investigating when there are concerns about the integrity of science. And, I think most of them are slow and, the process is somewhat opaque. I'd like to see it more transparent and a faster process than what we see. But there are, processes for dealing with these sorts of things. But again, I think there's a certain naivety about how big a deal this is in our field.
Schrag says the scientific community needs to have a no tolerance policy when dealing with falsified data and cover ups.
I think when we see it, it needs to be called out and addressed and corrected, in a proportionate and fair way. I think everybody deserves to have their voices heard, but when it happens, it needs to be addressed. And I think there's a genuine reluctance in this field, and I think in science in general, to address this. I think people are very worried about people's confidence in the scientific enterprise, and they're worried that this is going to erode the public's trust in us corporately. And I would argue that the general public will trust us more if we deal with these things in a very candid way. If we worry less about what people will think and more about getting the answers right, I think that the end result will be greater confidence in our science.
He says that some scientific journals are starting to put in place more practices that will hopefully help strengthen the oversight on research papers. One of these strategies is to include the original data in the online publication.
And I think that's very helpful because it sort of archives, more of the raw data so we can go back and look at it. But it's also scientifically very beneficial because there's often a lot of details hidden in that data that can be useful to other scientists. So it's not just an integrity issue. It's also about disseminating your science more fully.
Schrag worries that if scientists themselves don't recognize and solve these issues sooner rather than later, this will only slow down the search for medical breakthroughs.
There will be science police, that there will be external forces that will be created to regulate us. So I think that's always been, the concern among the professions is that if we don't act responsibly, that there will be other people stepping in to regulate us. And I think that would be bad for science if that happened. I mean, it may at this stage be inevitable.
And if it turns out that the 2006 Alzheimer's paper was falsified, what does that mean for the past 16 years of research? Millions of dollars and countless hours have been poured into these studies working off these findings. Has it all been for nothing?
It was an important part of the foundation of this oligomer hypothesis. Very few and probably none of the major hypotheses, certainly for Alzheimer's disease or most any other major disease, hinge on a single paper. Right. And I think that it would be overstating things to say that, decades of research had been wasted, but it is a very consequential and important part of the oligomer hypothesis. And it gets at whether some of our assumptions in this area may not be quite correct.
While Schrag says the last decades of Alzheimer's research have still been helpful, he thinks it's time for the field to let go of the amyloid hypothesis and the oligomer theory.
I think the field has tunnel visioned on this theory for about 30 years. And the issue is not at all solely about this one paper from Sylvie and Leslie, although I think it's an interesting part of the story. But I think you also have to look now at 20 years of clinical trials that really haven't moved the needle. Clinical trials targeting beta amyloid clearance, some of which have been very successful in removing beta amyloid, none of which has given patients their memory back. So I think you're going to hear a lot of talk and a lot of controversy, but I think that the field is coming to the conclusion that this hypothesis is dead and it's time to move on.
Which means that the future of Alzheimer's research could look very different than previously thought. Schrag says there's various theories that are ready to be tested, but just haven't been given the opportunity.
I think in this case, we've had other, really good, interesting ideas that have just not gotten the traction they need because the funding has been really dominated by one set of ideas. So I think we're seeing now investment looking at neuroinflammation in the brain and the role that, inflammatory pathways may play either in the cause, but certainly in the progression of some of the changes related to Alzheimer's disease.
Tau proteins are another area scientists are focusing on. Schrag hopes that the field starts to have more diversified research interests rather than honing in on one idea. Schrag says this has to be an intentional decision, otherwise we'll revert back to having tunnel vision.
When we artificially support one and suppress the other ideas, you're going to create this kind of tunnel vision, which can be harmful. And so I think part of this propagates itself. It can start small and build if we're not intentionally investing in alternative ideas.
Mistakes and failures are a key part of scientific discovery. Much of what we have today, from X-rays to insulin, is thanks to accidents in research. Even at the most basic level, a failed experiment can serve as a guide for future ideas. You can find more information about Dr. Matthew Schrag and all of our guests on our website, radiohealthjournal.org. Our writer-producer is Kristen Farah. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. I'm Elizabeth Westfield. Coming up next week on Radio Health Journal.
If I had fallen immediately to the floor in the bathroom, shrieking in agony and terror, I wouldn't have gotten myself out of there.
How one woman saved herself from a deadly explosion.
Then, a lesson we should all take from scientific research.
If you are passionate about something, keep going, don't give up. Mistakes can and do happen, but it doesn't mean you're on the wrong path. It just means you're learning.
All that and more on Radio Health Journal.
I'm Nancy Benson, host of Radio Health Journal. If you enjoy listening to Radio Health Journal, you'll also like our sister show, Viewpoints, which covers a wide array of topics from education to history to the environment. Here's a preview of what they're covering this week on Viewpoints.
If anybody needed anything from the president, they put it in writing directly to her. She wrote back. She drafted public statements. She decided who saw him.
The first female president you've never heard of. Then,
you need to care about whether and when we might finally be able to see a full account of what our leaders have done in our name.
The daunting task of declassifying government secrets. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth this week on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
Listen to Viewpoints on your favorite radio station and subscribe and listen to shows anytime on Apple Podcasts and Google Play.
And that's Radio Health Journal for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more. And check Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify for a library of past programs. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and information about our guests at radiohealthjournal.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Radio Health Journal.